Washington, D.C. history. The big trouble if D.C. becomes the 51st state. Washington, D.C., the capital of the United States, holds a truly unique position in the nation's geography and politics. Unlike any other city in the country, Washington, D.C. doesn't belong to any of the 50 states. Instead, the 64 square miles that make up the city form a federal district, directly controlled by the United States Congress. This unusual status creates some complicated, and often controversial, consequences. Every citizen living in the 50 states has representation in Congress. They elect members to the House of Representatives based on population and 2 senators per state. But the 714,000 residents of Washington, D.C. don't get that same privilege. Because D.C. isn't a state, and not part of any state, its citizens have no voting representation in Congress. They pay federal taxes just like everyone else, but they have no say in how those taxes are set or spent. The irony isn't lost on the people of Washington, D.C. Their license plates famously bear the slogan, "Taxation without representation." As of 2019, D.C. residents actually pay more in federal income tax than the residents of 21 states. On a per-person basis, they pay more than anyone else in the country, yet have no voting power in the very body that sets their tax rates. Understandably, this situation has sparked a fierce and ongoing fight for D.C. statehood. In 2016, an overwhelming 86% of D.C. voters supported becoming the 51st state of the Union. Even President Joe Biden has voiced his support. Advocates argue that full statehood would finally grant D.C. residents the representation and voice they've long been denied. But not everyone agrees. Opposition across the country remains strong, and the debate over D.C.'s future has become one of the most contentious political issues in modern America. To understand why this conflict exists, we have to go back more than 2 centuries, to the very founding of the United States. After the American Revolution, the newly formed nation was more of a loose alliance of states, each with its own priorities and political philosophies. The Founding Fathers feared that placing the capital within any one state would give that state too much power over the federal government. Their solution was written directly into the Constitution. The seat of federal power would be located in a federally controlled district, independent from any state. The area couldn't exceed 10 miles square, 100 square miles total, and would serve as neutral ground, equally belonging to all Americans. However, the Constitution didn't specify where this district should be or how small it could be. That flexibility would later shape the unique, sometimes chaotic, history of Washington, D.C., and ignite the centuries-long debate over whether it deserves to be America's 51st state. Washington, D.C. history, from founding to the fight for representation. It was George Washington himself who chose the site of the new capital. He decided it would sit along the Potomac River, between the states of Virginia and Maryland. Both states donated land to create the 10-mile square federal district, Virginia contributing the southern half and Maryland the northern. This area became what we now know as Washington, D.C., a city directly governed by the United States Congress. But the creation of the new district came with a serious flaw. People already lived on that land, citizens who suddenly found themselves without a state. They lost the right to vote for members of Congress, and even for the president, since those rights were reserved only for state residents. Instead, Congress appointed D.C.'s mayor and city council, leaving the local population voiceless in the very government that ruled them. For over 2 centuries, this arrangement has been deeply unpopular. The residents of D.C. have fought a long and gradual battle for equal rights and representation. By 1846, frustration among residents, particularly those living in the former Virginian portion of the district, began to grow. Many were slaveholders, and they feared that Congress, influenced by abolitionists, might outlaw slavery within the district. Since they had no representatives to defend their interests, they petitioned Virginia to take back the land it had given. Congress agreed, and in 1846, that land was returned to Virginia. This move, driven largely by the desire to preserve slavery, defined D.C.'s modern boundaries, reducing the district from 100 square miles to about 64 square miles, the size it remains today. At the time, Washington, D.C. was still small, with fewer than 50,000 residents in the 1850s, far less than any state's population. But the decades ahead would bring massive change. The Civil War, industrialization, Jim Crow, 2 world wars, and the civil rights movement transformed both the city and the country. By the 1960s, DC's population had exploded to over 750,000 people, larger than several U.S. states and nearly 0.5% of the entire nation's population. Yet, despite this incredible growth, DC residents still couldn't vote for Congress or govern themselves. By the 1950s and 60s, this injustice became especially glaring. The majority of DC's population, about 54% by 1960, were African Americans, more than 400,000 people of color who had no voting representation in the government of their own country. Finally, in 1961, progress came. Congress passed the 23rd Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, granting D.C. residents the right to vote in presidential elections. Here's how it worked. U.S. presidents are chosen through the Electoral College, with each state receiving a number of electors based on its total congressional delegation, 2 senators and at least 1 representative. The 23rd Amendment allowed D.C. to participate as if it were a state, assigning it a number of electors equal to the smallest state in the Union, 3 electors, the same as Wyoming. That meant the people of Washington, D.C., could finally cast their votes for president. Their first opportunity came in the 1964 election between Lyndon B. Johnson and Barry Goldwater, a historic milestone for democracy in the capital. However, this amendment only solved part of the problem. D.C. residents still had no voting representation in Congress, and Congress still had total control over their local government. In 1970, another partial step was taken. Congress passed the District of Columbia Delegate Act, allowing D.C. residents to elect a non-voting delegate to the House of Representatives. This delegate could attend sessions, speak on the floor, and propose legislation, but could not actually vote. This arrangement still exists today. Then, in 1973, the District of Columbia Home Rule Act was passed. For the first time, D.C. residents could elect their own mayor and city council. In 1975, Walter Washington made history as the first African-American mayor of a major U.S. city. But even with these reforms, Congress still holds ultimate authority over D.C.'s laws and budget, and the president retains control over the D.C. National Guard. In essence, the people of the nation's capital still live under the supervision of a government they cannot fully influence, a democratic contradiction at the heart of the United States itself. Despite gaining the right to vote in presidential elections, Washington, D.C. residents were still far from achieving true self-governance. They had no real control over their local affairs, the president continued to oversee the D.C. National Guard, and they had no voting representation in Congress. In 1978, Congress tried once again to change that. Lawmakers proposed a new constitutional amendment designed to finally give D.C. residents a voice in Congress. Much like the 23rd Amendment before it, this one would treat the district as if it were a state for the purpose of elections, but this time, it would go even further. If ratified, the amendment would have granted Washington, D.C. 1 full voting representative in the House and 2 senators in the U.S. Senate, all without technically classifying D.C. as a state. The proposal passed in Congress with the required 2/3 majority, but that was only the first step. As with any constitutional amendment, it still needed to be ratified by 3/4 of the state legislatures, 38 states in total. Lawmakers gave the states 7 years to decide. But when the deadline arrived, only 16 had approved. The amendment fell short by 22 states and ultimately failed. That failure sparked frustration, and ignited a powerful new movement within Washington, D.C. Residents began to argue that the only permanent solution was to become America's 51st state. By 1982, D.C. voters took matters into their own hands. They ratified a proposed state constitution for what they called New Columbia and created a shadow delegation, 2 shadow senators and 1 shadow representative, whose sole mission was to lobby Congress for D.C. statehood. Finally, in 1993, the dream of D.C. statehood reached Congress for the very first time. A formal statehood bill was introduced in the House of Representatives. To succeed, it only needed a simple majority in both chambers, far easier than passing a constitutional amendment. But even with that lower threshold, the bill failed on its very first step. Out of 435 representatives, 277 voted against it while 153 voted in favor. President Bill Clinton, who became the first sitting president to openly support D.C. statehood, couldn't change the outcome. The reason for the defeat was largely political. Of the 277 no votes, 172 were Republicans, nearly every Republican in the House, while 105 were Democrats. Meanwhile, of the 153 yes votes, 151 came from Democrats, 1 from independent Bernie Sanders, and just 1 from a Republican. This deep partisan divide reflected a political reality. If Washington, D.C. were ever to become a state, it would almost certainly be a solid Democratic stronghold. D.C. voters haven't elected a single Republican to their city council since 2009, and in every presidential election since 1964, they've overwhelmingly supported the Democratic candidate. In 2020, Joe Biden won 92% of the vote in D.C. That makes the issue far more than just a question of representation, it's a matter of political balance in Congress. Granting statehood to D.C. would almost guarantee 2 new Democratic senators and 1 new Democratic representative, permanently shifting power in the Senate. It's no wonder, then, that Democrats have long supported D.C. statehood while Republicans have opposed it. Yet despite the failed vote in 1993, the movement hasn't gone away. Presidents Clinton, Obama, and Biden have all voiced support for statehood, while George W. Bush opposed it and Donald Trump vowed to veto it if it ever reached his desk. Over the years, more than 150 proposed amendments and bills have been introduced in Congress to grant representation to Washington, D.C., a powerful testament to how long this fight has endured and how deeply it's tied to the American struggle over democracy and equality. For decades, Washington, D.C.'s fight for full representation seemed to stall. Congress held hearing after hearing, but little ever came of them. Yet, by 2016, more than 20 years after the 1993 defeat, the movement for D.C. statehood began gaining momentum once again. That November, D.C. residents voted overwhelmingly in favor of becoming the 51st state, with nearly 86% supporting the proposal. Under this plan, the city's mayor would become the governor, the D.C. Council would transform into a state legislature, and the new state would be named Washington, D.C., short for Douglas Commonwealth, honoring the famed abolitionist and writer Frederick Douglass, who lived in the district for many years until his death in 1895. If successful, the proposal would have redrawn the map entirely. Most of the current district would form the new state of Washington, D.C., while a much smaller federal district would remain, a symbolic enclave surrounding the National Mall, the White House, the U.S. Capitol, the Supreme Court, and other core federal buildings and monuments. This new state would be America's first true city-state, and while the smallest in area, it would hardly be the smallest by population or economy. Washington, D.C. today has more residents than Wyoming and Vermont and roughly the same as Alaska. Economically, it would boast a larger GDP than 17 U.S. states, including Nebraska and Arkansas. It would also become the state with the highest percentage of African American residents, around 41% of its population, a powerful symbol of representation and equality. Of course, statehood would also mean updating one of the nation's most recognizable symbols, the American flag, which would add a 51st star. And, at long last, D.C. residents would gain 1 full voting representative in the House and 2 senators in the U.S. Senate, bringing the total to 436 representatives and 102 senators. That dream came closer than ever on June 26, 2020, when the D.C. statehood bill reached the House of Representatives for the second time in U.S. history. Unlike in 1993, this time the bill actually passed, with 232 votes in favor and 180 against. Every single Republican representative voted no, joined by 1 Democrat and 1 Libertarian, while every other Democrat voted yes. However, victory was short-lived. The bill then moved to the Senate, where Republicans held the majority, and President Donald Trump had already vowed to veto the measure if it reached his desk. Predictably, the bill died in the Senate, stalling the dream once again. Republicans argued that D.C. statehood was a political maneuver designed to permanently add 2 Democratic senators. Some proposed an alternative. Rather than granting D.C. statehood, return the land to Maryland, the state that had originally donated it over 2 centuries earlier. They pointed to precedent. In 1846, Congress returned the portion of D.C. once ceded by Virginia. So, they argued, Congress could just as easily return Maryland's contribution, leaving behind only a small federal enclave around the Capitol and the National Mall. In that case, the 714,000 residents of Washington, D.C. would become Maryland citizens, automatically gaining representation through Maryland's 2 existing senators and an additional House seat. But there's a problem: neither side wants that. The vast majority of D.C. residents don't want to become part of Maryland. They want their own state, their own identity, and their own voice in Congress. Likewise, Maryland's government has repeatedly stated it has no desire to reclaim D.C. land. Polling confirms it. A 2016 public policy poll found that only 28% of Marylanders supported annexing D.C., while a 2019 Washington Post survey revealed that 57% opposed the idea outright. And beyond the politics, there's a stranger constitutional issue hiding in plain sight. If Maryland were to take D.C. back without repealing the 23rd Amendment, the remaining tiny federal district, the area around the White House and the National Mall, would still technically hold 3 electoral votes in presidential elections. In theory, that would mean the few dozen people living or working inside that small federal zone could hold the same number of electoral votes as the entire state of Wyoming, a bizarre and undemocratic loophole that shows just how complicated the D.C. statehood debate truly is. In presidential elections, the question of what to do with the tiny federal district that would remain if D.C. were granted statehood or annexed to Maryland poses a major constitutional dilemma. Under current law, that small area would still be considered a full state, entitled to appoint 3 electors to the Electoral College. Now, imagine this: the only residents within that district would likely be the president, their family, and a handful of aides living within the White House grounds. In that bizarre scenario, the sitting president would personally control 3 out of the 538 total electoral votes, roughly half a percentage point of the entire national total. To put that into perspective, the president alone would hold as much voting power as the entire state of Delaware, home to over 1 million people. Such an arrangement would give the commander-in-chief an extraordinary and undemocratic advantage, effectively allowing them to cast electoral votes in their own re-election or on behalf of their chosen successor. Fixing this imbalance wouldn't be easy. Removing that power would require repealing the 23rd Amendment, a process that demands a 2/3 majority in both the House and Senate, and ratification by 3/4 of all states. And history shows just how difficult that is. In more than 2 centuries, only one constitutional amendment has ever been successfully repealed: the 18th Amendment, which established prohibition. It was later overturned by the 21st Amendment. This potential issue doesn't only arise from Maryland annexation. Even if Washington, D.C. became the 51st state, the problem would remain, as the small federal district would still legally retain those 3 electors. To address this, the D.C. Statehood Bill includes a clause to fast-track the repeal of the 23rd Amendment once statehood is achieved. But as many lawmakers know, that's much easier said than done. Would 2/3 of Congress and 3/4 of U.S. states really agree to strip the president of the power to cast what amounts to 1 million votes in their own election? While the answer remains uncertain, what is clear is that D.C.'s fight for statehood has not slowed down. After a second failure in 2020, nearly the same statehood bill returned to the House in 2021, this time with Democrats newly in control of the White House and holding a razor-thin majority in the Senate, split 50-50, with Vice President Kamala Harris holding the decisive tie-breaking vote. With that delicate balance of power, D.C. once again stood on the edge of his Tory. If the bill had ever reached the Senate floor for a vote, it would almost certainly have passed by the narrowest of margins, and gone straight to President Biden's desk for signature. On April 22, 2021, the House of Representatives once again passed the D.C. Statehood Bill, this time by a vote of 216 to 208, a tight margin, falling almost perfectly along partisan lines. Democrats overwhelmingly voted yes, while nearly all Republicans opposed the measure. Yet even with Democrats holding a slim majority, the bill faced an uphill battle in the Senate, largely due to the filibuster. Under Senate rules, a filibustered bill requires 60 votes out of 100 to advance to the floor, meaning at least 10 Republican senators would have to agree just to allow the vote to happen. In today's deeply divided Congress, that was never like. And so, despite over 2 centuries of debate, Washington, D.C.'s long quest for representation in Congress remains unresolved. How to finally grant 714,000 American citizens the same voting rights enjoyed by every other state continues to stand as one of the most complex and pressing political challenges in the 21st century. But as we reflect on D.C.'s struggle, It's worth remembering that this issue is only one of many confronting humanity today. Across the globe, countless challenges, political, social, and environmental, demand new solutions, and above all, new generations of people willing to take them on. That's where organizations like 80,000 Hours come in. They're a non-profit organization, funded entirely through philanthropic donations, dedicated to helping people build impactful and fulfilling careers that make a difference in the world. Backed by over a decade of research with academics from Oxford University, 80,000 Hours provides detailed, evidence-based guides to help you find a path that not only brings personal satisfaction, but also helps solve some of humanity's biggest problems. Whether you're just starting your career, considering a midlife change, or simply seeking a more purpose-driven path, they offer an incredible range of free resources, from in-depth career guides and templates to podcasts, newsletters, and a job board featuring hundreds of opportunities proven to create positive change. And the best part? It's completely free, for everyone, forever. So if you're wondering what to do with the roughly 80,000 working hours in your lifetime, visit 80,000 Hours through the link below or click on the screen now to receive your free guide. You might just find the path that helps you change the world. And as always, thank you for watching.